On a morning in the middle of December 1942, the Tunisian sun had already begun its relentless climb across a cloudless sky. The desert stretched in every direction, an endless expanse of sand and rock that shimmered with waves of heat even in the early hours. German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim stood on a slight elevation, his uniform already dusty from the morning wind that swept across the North African landscape. He had been fighting in this godforsaken theatre for months now, and the peculiarities of desert warfare had become familiar to him. The way visibility could extend for miles on a clear day, the brutal temperature swings between day and night, the constant mechanical failures as sand worked its way into every piece of equipment. But what he witnessed that morning would puzzle him in a way that no amount of desert experience had prepared him for. Through his field glasses, he observed an American column approaching from the east. The ridge they crested stood perhaps a kilometre away, and as the vehicles began their descent, von Arnim expected to see the typical parade of military might: Sherman tanks with their distinctive rounded turrets, perhaps some of those heavy armoured half-tracks the Americans seemed so fond of, maybe artillery pieces being towed behind trucks. Instead, what materialized before his eyes seemed almost comical at first glance. Dozens upon dozens of small, boxy vehicles poured over that ridge like a swarm of mechanical insects. They were diminutive, open-topped contraptions that bounced and leaped over the rocky terrain with an agility that seemed impossible for a motor vehicle. They moved with remarkable speed, kicking up enormous plumes of dust behind them as they scattered in multiple directions. There was something almost chaotic about their movement, yet within that apparent disorder, von Arnim could detect an underlying coordination. These little machines were everywhere at once, darting left and right, moving in seemingly random patterns that defied conventional military doctrine about vehicle formation. A young lieutenant standing beside the general muttered something under his breath in German. The words were dismissive, contemptuous even, something about toy cars, playthings that had no business on a battlefield. Von Arnim lowered his field glasses slowly, his weathered face settling into a deep frown. Unlike his subordinate, the general did not laugh. His years of military experience had taught him that underestimating an enemy's equipment was a fatal mistake. What he was observing might look ridiculous, might appear to be nothing more than a collection of civilian runabouts somehow pressed into military service, but something about the sheer quantity of them, the effortless way they navigated terrain that would challenge many German vehicles, gave him pause. The general was witnessing something that would become a defining characteristic of American military power during the Second World War, though he could not have fully understood it in that moment. That little vehicle bouncing across the Tunisian landscape was the Willys MB, universally known simply as the Jeep. This unassuming machine would evolve into far more than just another piece of military hardware. It would become the very embodiment of American industrial philosophy and military mobility, a symbol that would come to represent everything the United States brought to the war effort: mass production, standardization, practical engineering, and an almost overwhelming abundance of materiel. By the time the conflict finally ended in the summer of 1945, American factories had produced close to 650,000 of these remarkable vehicles. Think about that number for a moment. 650,000 individual machines, each one capable of carrying men and supplies across virtually any terrain on Earth. To put this in perspective, this meant approximately one Jeep for every 50 American soldiers who served during the entire war. For German generals like von Arnim, men who had been raised in a military tradition that still relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons for logistics, who commanded armies that operated under constant fuel rationing and severe resource constraints, such numbers were simply incomprehensible. The German military machine, despite its fearsome reputation and undeniable tactical prowess, struggled constantly with the mundane realities of logistics. Their supply columns still included requisitioned civilian trucks of varying quality and capability, vehicles that broke down frequently and for which spare parts were increasingly difficult to obtain. On the brutal Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht faced the vastness of the Soviet Union, German units often resorted to using captured enemy vehicles or even pressed oxen and horses into service for moving supplies. The contrast could not have been more stark. Here was an enemy nation, fighting a war on multiple continents simultaneously, deploying a specialized vehicle so abundantly, so casually, that it transformed every small unit into a highly mobile force. Nazi intelligence services had received reports about this American Jeep before it appeared in significant numbers in combat theaters. The analysts who reviewed these reports, comfortable in their offices in Berlin, had dismissed the vehicle as fundamentally impractical. They viewed it as a gimmick, perhaps even a propaganda tool designed to boost American morale. The idea that a military would devote substantial industrial capacity to producing what appeared to be a glorified civilian car seemed wasteful, inefficient, contrary to everything German military doctrine taught about resource allocation. They were, as events would prove, catastrophically wrong in their assessment. The story of how this vehicle came into existence reveals much about American industrial culture and military thinking in the late 1930s and early 1940s. In July of 1940, as Europe burned and France fell to German armour, the United States Army issued what seemed like an almost desperate request to American automotive manufacturers. The specifications were demanding to the point of seeming contradictory. Design and produce a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle with four-wheel drive capability, something that weighed less than 1,300 pounds fully equipped, yet capable of carrying a crew and a mounted machine gun. This miracle machine needed to be able to climb grades of 60% or steeper and reach speeds of 50 miles per hour on flat ground. To most automotive engineers of the era, these requirements seemed to conflict with basic physics and mechanical engineering principles. Only two companies initially accepted the challenge. American Bantam, a small automobile manufacturer that had been struggling financially, saw this as a potential lifeline. Willys Overland, another company with a checkered recent history, also threw their hat into the ring. American Bantam actually produced the first working prototype, a remarkable achievement for such a small firm. Their engineers worked around the clock, improvising solutions to problems that would have stymied larger organizations weighed down by bureaucracy. However, it was Willys who ultimately refined and perfected the design in ways that made mass production feasible. The heart of the Willys design was an engine they called the Go Devil, a remarkable piece of engineering that generated 60 horsepower from a relatively compact inline four-cylinder configuration. This might not sound impressive by modern standards, but for a vehicle weighing barely more than a ton, it provided surprising strength and pulling power. The engine was robust, relatively simple to maintain, and capable of running on the variable quality fuel that would be found in combat zones around the world. Ford Motor Company, with its vast production capacity and experience in mass manufacturing, eventually entered the picture as well, beginning to stamp out Jeeps in enormous quantities. What made the American production system truly revolutionary was the degree of standardization achieved. Ford had pioneered many mass production techniques decades earlier with the Model T, but the Jeep program took these concepts to new heights. Nearly every component had an identifying mark. Ford stamped an F on virtually every part they manufactured. American soldiers, with their irreverent sense of humor, joked that the Jeep was so perfectly standardized that you could take a bolt from a vehicle built in one factory and install it in a Jeep from an entirely different manufacturer without any modification or adjustment. This might sound like an exaggeration, but it was remarkably close to the truth. When German officers eventually captured intact Jeeps and subjected them to detailed examination, they were genuinely astonished by what they discovered. The parts were numbered systematically, the maintenance manual was clear and comprehensive, and components were genuinely interchangeable across different production batches and even different manufacturers. This represented an entirely alien concept to German engineering culture, which prized craftsmanship and precise hand-fitting. German vehicles were often masterpieces of engineering, but this very sophistication made them difficult and time-consuming to repair in field conditions. Specialized tools might be required, parts might need adjustment to fit properly, and trained technicians were necessary for even routine maintenance. By 1942, the American production machine had reached truly staggering levels of output. One Jeep rolled off American assembly lines every 2 minutes. Let that sink in for a moment. Every 120 seconds, somewhere in the United States, a complete Jeep emerged from a factory, ready to be crated up and shipped to some distant corner of the world where American forces were fighting. To provide perspective on this industrial achievement, consider that Ford's massive River Rouge plant in Michigan was producing approximately 100 Jeeps per hour at peak capacity, running operations 24 hours per day without significant interruption. In the time it took Germany to hand-build a single complex staff car for a senior officer, American factories had produced dozens upon dozens of Jeeps. These vehicles were not merely limited to paved roads or even improved dirt tracks. The four-wheel drive system, combined with innovative leaf spring suspension, gave the Jeep the ability to tackle virtually any terrain. Mud that would bog down conventional vehicles proved little obstacle. Snow and ice, which paralyzed many military operations, merely slowed the Jeep slightly. Desert sand, which had defeated entire armies throughout history, proved manageable. Dense jungle, with its roots and obstacles, could be navigated. The Jeep could ford streams and shallow rivers, climb embankments that seemed impossibly steep, and execute turns in spaces that would require multiple maneuvers from larger vehicles. American soldiers, known for their ingenuity and practical problem-solving approach, quickly realized that the Jeep was far more than a simple transport vehicle. It was a platform, a blank canvas upon which they could improvise solutions to countless problems. They converted Jeeps into battlefield ambulances, removing the rear seats and installing stretchers. They welded steel plates onto the body and mounted heavier weapons, creating what they called gun Jeeps that could provide mobile fire support. Creative mechanics stretched the chassis and modified the drivetrain to create railroad trolleys that could run on captured enemy rail lines. In perhaps the most audacious modification, engineers developed methods to strap Jeeps inside gliders, allowing them to be dropped behind enemy lines along with airborne troops. One particular aspect of the Jeep program astonished German intelligence analysts when they finally pieced together the full picture. Through the Lend-Lease program, which America used to supply its allies with war materiel, the United States shipped more than 50,000 Jeeps to the Soviet Union. These vehicles arrived via dangerous Arctic convoys that braved German U-boats and aircraft, or through the lengthy Persian corridor route through Iran. Soviet generals, not known for praising foreign equipment given their fierce national pride, lauded the Jeep as superior to their own light reconnaissance vehicles. Red Army soldiers affectionately nicknamed it the American Mule, a term of endearment that recognized its ability to carry loads across impossible terrain without complaint. At the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most brutal urban combat environments in military history, some Red Army units employed Jeeps as forward artillery spotters. These nimble vehicles would dash through rubble-choked streets, navigate around collapsed buildings, and position themselves where they could guide devastating Katyusha rocket fire onto German positions. German troops, fighting house to house in the frozen ruins of the city, were shocked and demoralized to find themselves being shelled by rockets spotted and directed by what looked like nothing more than a civilian runabout that should have been delivering groceries in peacetime. In North Africa, where the war had a particularly mobile character, unlike the grinding stalemate of earlier Western Front battles, the Jeep's advantages became even more apparent. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, noticed the disparity in mobility between the forces under his command and the increasingly well-equipped American units. His vaunted Africa Corps, despite its fearsome reputation, relied heavily on captured British trucks and fuel-thirsty German vehicles that frequently broke down in the harsh desert conditions. Sand worked its way into engines and transmissions, dust storms could damage equipment irreparably, and the extreme temperatures caused all manner of mechanical failures. Meanwhile, American Jeeps seemed to skip across the dunes with almost casual ease, bringing ammunition and water to frontline units faster than German logistics could respond. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German soldiers, already struggling with supply shortages and mechanical breakdowns, watched in frustration as enemy forces moved with a freedom they could only envy. A captured German staff report from early 1943 recorded the situation with barely concealed bitterness. The enemy possesses a small motor vehicle, capable of sustaining long marches, carrying men and equipment over terrain our machines cannot cross. Their mobility exceeds ours in every measurable category. The psychological dimension of the Jeep went far beyond simple mechanical superiority. For German officers, particularly those from aristocratic backgrounds who had been raised in the traditions of the Prussian military establishment, war machines were supposed to possess a certain gravitas. Tanks should be massive and imposing, aircraft should be sleek and powerful, artillery should be grand and destructive. The Jeep looked absurd by these standards. It was small, utilitarian, lacking in any aesthetic appeal or martial impressiveness. Yet this very humility, this apparent ordinariness, concealed its true genius. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who commanded Allied forces in Europe and understood logistics and industrial capacity perhaps better than any other senior officer, would later make a remarkable statement. He called the Jeep one of the three decisive weapons of the entire war, placing it alongside the C-47 transport aircraft and the various landing craft designs that made amphibious operations possible. This was not hyperbole or sentimentality. Eisenhower recognized that wars are won not merely through tactical brilliance or individual courage, but through the unglamorous work of moving supplies, maintaining communications, evacuating wounded soldiers, and keeping armies mobile and flexible. When von Arnim's staff officers attempted to calculate how many Jeeps the Americans had deployed in Tunisia, they arrived at figures that seemed impossible. Their calculations must be wrong, they reasoned, because surely no country, no matter how industrially powerful, would expend resources on producing so many of what appeared to be non-essential vehicles. Military doctrine, as they understood it, prioritized tanks, artillery, aircraft, weapons that could directly engage and destroy the enemy. The idea of producing hundreds of thousands of simple transport vehicles seemed like a gross misallocation of industrial capacity. Yet even as these German officers were dismissing the numbers as implausible, American convoys were unloading thousands more Jeeps at the ports of Algiers and Oran, each one packed in wooden crates like oversized children's toys, ready to be assembled and pressed into service. This brings us to another aspect of the Jeep that few German officers fully appreciated until they saw it with their own eyes. A Jeep could be completely disassembled, packed into a wooden crate with dimensions that made it easy to stack and ship, transported halfway around the world, and then reassembled by 4 reasonably competent soldiers in less than an hour. American quartermasters, those unsung heroes who managed the incomprehensibly complex logistics of a global war, absolutely loved this feature. German supply officers, reading intelligence reports about vehicles arriving in boxes and being assembled in the field, dismissed such accounts as American propaganda, lies designed to intimidate or demoralize. In truth, the Jeep's modularity and the simplicity of its design made it arguably the most deployable military vehicle in history. The full scope of the shock that German forces experienced became even more apparent during the European campaign following the D-Day landings in Normandy. Jeeps became the literal arteries of the Allied advance across France and into Germany itself. They carried generals like George Patton, who was famous for his aggressive, mobile warfare tactics. They transported medics rushing to treat wounded soldiers under fire. They brought chaplains to deliver field services and provide spiritual comfort in the midst of carnage. They even carried Hollywood celebrities like Clark Gable, who toured the front lines to boost morale. German prisoners of war marched to the rear under guard past seemingly endless rows of Jeeps parked nose to nose along roads and in fields, an unending river of steel and rubber that stretched as far as the eye could see. To these prisoners, many of whom had marched hundreds of kilometers on foot during their service, who had seen their own units gradually lose mobility as vehicles broke down and fuel ran short, it seemed as if America's factories had simply decided to provide every single soldier with his own private automobile. In one particularly poignant captured letter that German censors intercepted before it could reach its destination, a soldier wrote to his wife back home, "The Americans drive to war as if going on holiday. Even their officers ride in open cars, exposed to the elements and enemy fire, while we march endlessly on foot. It is not fair. It is not possible to fight an enemy with such resources." The letter captured perfectly the sense of helplessness and inevitability that many German soldiers felt as the war ground toward its conclusion. The reality behind this appearance of abundance was what might be called industrial democracy. The Jeep's fundamental simplicity meant that virtually anyone could operate it effectively. A farmer who had been drafted from Kansas, whose previous mechanical experience extended only to maintaining farm equipment, could drive a Jeep and repair its carburetor using nothing more than basic hand tools and common sense. A teenager from Brooklyn who had never owned a car could swap out a Jeep's transmission while standing in ankle-deep mud, following procedures clearly outlined in the manual. Spare parts flowed through the supply system so freely that American mechanics sometimes constructed entirely functional Jeeps from leftover components and damaged vehicles, creating what they called Frankenstein Jeeps that combined parts from multiple sources. German generals, trapped in a situation of ever-worsening shortages where every spare part was precious and every litre of fuel had to be carefully rationed, could only shake their heads in disbelief at such apparent waste. What they failed to understand was that this wasn't waste at all. It was a deliberate strategy that prioritized keeping equipment operational over protecting scarce resources. The American military would rather have abundant spare parts sitting unused in warehouses than have a single vehicle disabled for lack of a simple component. By the war's end, Jeeps had appeared in virtually every corner of the globe where combat operations took place. They rolled ashore on the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, their drivers navigating through obstacles and enemy fire. They navigated the narrow roads and steep hillsides of Italian vineyards, carrying supplies to mountain troops. They bounced along jungle trails in Burma, where the dense vegetation and monsoon rains created conditions that would have stopped most vehicles. They even landed on remote Pacific islands, where Navy construction battalions, the famous Seabees, strapped them to barges and drove them directly onto beaches through the surf. Jeeps pulled artillery pieces into position, their surprising torque allowing them to move guns that seemed too heavy for such a small vehicle. They carried radar sets and radio equipment, serving as mobile communications platforms. They hauled mail from rear areas to frontline units, maintaining the crucial connection between soldiers and their homes. They delivered generals to surrender ceremonies, providing the stage for some of the war's most historically significant moments. When General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, a Jeep had driven him to the pier where he boarded the launch that took him to the ship. Symbolically, this humble vehicle had outlasted all of the Third Reich's proudest weapons, the Tiger tanks, the V-2 rockets, the jet aircraft that represented the cutting edge of technology. For the Germans, the Jeep represented both a revelation and a profound humiliation. Their armies had mocked it, their intelligence services had dismissed it as impractical, their engineers had considered it beneath their standards of precision and craftsmanship. Only through bitter experience did they learn that it was perhaps the most effective workhorse of the entire conflict. When von Arnim finally surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, along with the remnants of the once proud Afrika Korps, captured documents revealed that his staff officers had asked their American counterparts one final question that had been troubling them throughout the campaign. How many Jeeps did the Americans actually have in North Africa? The Americans, with their characteristic informality and sense of humor, reportedly laughed at the question. The answer they gave was simple. Enough. That single word, enough, contained within it the entire philosophy that had allowed the United States to win the industrial war that ran parallel to the shooting war. America hadn't just built a car when they created the Jeep. They had built a symbol of industrial might, a physical manifestation of their ability to produce goods in quantities that defied the imagination of enemies and allies alike. They had created a machine so ordinary, so unassuming, that it became extraordinary through sheer ubiquity and reliability. By 1945, with approximately 500,000 Jeeps rolling across roads and trails and beaches and deserts worldwide, German generals who had survived the war knew the mathematics of their defeat. Each individual Jeep might be small, might seem insignificant, might lack the impressive appearance of a tank or the devastating firepower of a bomber. But multiplied by hundreds of thousands, distributed across every theatre of operations, capable of going anywhere and doing anything and never stopping, these little vehicles had contributed to an overwhelming superiority in mobility and logistics that German forces simply could not match. The war wasn't won exclusively with massive tanks or heavy bombers or aircraft carriers, though all of these certainly played crucial roles. Sometimes victory came through the accumulation of small advantages, the steady application of industrial capacity to solve practical problems, to put hundreds of thousands of reliable, simple vehicles in the hands of soldiers who needed them. The Jeep exemplified everything that made American military power so formidable. Not necessarily superior quality in any single component, but overwhelming quantity, excellent reliability, ease of maintenance, and the flexibility to adapt to countless different roles and situations. When German military historians and generals sat down after the war to analyze what had gone wrong, to understand how they had lost despite early advantages and despite the undeniable skill and courage of their soldiers, the Jeep always appeared in their assessments. Some dismissed it as a minor factor, preferring to focus on larger strategic failures and the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies in general. Others, however, recognized it as a symptom of a deeper problem. Germany had approached the war with an industrial base and military doctrine that belonged to an earlier era, while America had revolutionized warfare through mass production and standardization. The contrast between these two philosophies could be seen in 1,000 small details. When a German vehicle broke down, it often required a skilled mechanic, specialized tools, and parts that might take weeks to arrive through the overstretched supply system. When an American Jeep broke down, any soldier with basic mechanical aptitude could often fix it using improvised tools and parts scavenged from other vehicles. When German units needed to requisition new vehicles, they navigated through bureaucracy and waited for production facilities that were increasingly targeted by Allied bombing. When American units needed vehicles, they submitted requests that were usually filled within days or even hours from the seemingly bottomless supply depots that sprang up wherever American forces operated. The story of the Jeep is ultimately a story about how industrial capacity can become a weapon as devastating as any gun or bomb. It's about how unglamorous logistics and supply can determine the outcome of battles as surely as tactical brilliance. It's about how simplicity and reliability can triumph over sophistication and precision. Most importantly, it's about how a nation's character and values can be expressed through the tools it creates. The Jeep was democratic in its design. Anyone could use it, anyone could fix it. It didn't require special training or aristocratic privilege to master. It was abundant in a way that reflected American optimism and industrial confidence. It was practical and functional without pretense, reflecting a culture that valued getting the job done over impressive appearances. General von Arnim, standing in that Tunisian desert, watching those strange little vehicles swarm across the landscape, could not have fully grasped all of this in that moment. But somewhere in his experienced military mind, an alarm must have sounded. An army that could afford to distribute such vehicles so freely, that could deploy them in such numbers for seemingly minor tasks, possessed resources beyond anything Germany could hope to match. The toy-like appearance of those vehicles was deceiving. They represented a type of military power that rendered traditional calculations of tanks and divisions almost obsolete. They represented mobility, flexibility and industrial abundance that would prove decisive not just in North Africa, but in every theatre of the war. Those little vehicles bouncing across the desert were harbingers of Germany's ultimate defeat, symbols of an industrial and logistical superiority against which courage and tactical skill would ultimately prove insufficient.